"You're alive." Her scream ripped through the quiet room, sharp enough to make the heart monitor skip. I didn't flinch. I'd been sitting in the corner chair back against the wall awake for the past few minutes. The room was dim, heavy, with the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. The door creaked. I caught the scent of her perfume before I saw her face. Leora, my daughter-in-law. She froze in the doorway, clutching her purse like a shield. Her eyes went wide, mouth open, the scream still echoing in the space between us. Color drained from her cheeks until she looked almost translucent. I said nothing. Her gaze darted to the bed empty, then to the machines before finally locking on me. The sight seemed to pin her in place. Her knuckles whitened around the strap of her bag, breath coming faster now, as if she were staring at something she thought she'd never have to face again. I could almost hear her thoughts scrambling for an explanation, for a way to undo what she'd just seen. But there was none. I let the silence stretch until it felt like another weight in the room. Then I spoke. "You look surprised." Her head jerked slightly. They told me you were still unconscious." "Guess they were wrong," I said, evenly. "Or maybe no one bothered to check." She didn't reply. Instead, she turned stiffly toward the counter, pretending to pour herself a glass of water. Her shoulders tight, her movements calculated. "You came alone?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "Callan's parking." "Then let's wait for him," I replied. I pressed the call button, and within moments, I heard his voice outside the door. "Callan." I called, calm but clear, "You should come in." He stepped into the room, his eyes moving between us. The tension was thick enough to touch. I kept mine locked on Leora. She knew. And now she knew I did too. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked neatly inside a cream-colored envelope with embossed gold lettering. I nearly tossed it aside, thinking it was another charity appeal, until I saw the return address: Vallis, Brent and Dunley Private Estate Division. Edgar, my cousin, my late husband's only real friend, the man who once gave me a first edition Frost, just because I mentioned I liked poetry. We hadn't spoken in years. I opened the letter at the kitchen table, my tea untouched. Edgar had passed. No children, no spouse, no traditional will, just a sealed letter and a trust document naming me the sole beneficiary of his entire estate. The assets totaled over $100 million. I read it again and again. I hadn't even known he was ill or wealthy. He was always private, quiet, and odd in a way I found endearing. Now I understood just how carefully he'd kept things to himself. And now I had something to keep to myself, too. I told no one, not Callan, not Leora, not Miriam. I needed time. For a month, I carried the secret like a stone in my coat pocket. I reread Edgar's letter. I walked through my home. I made tea. I didn't dream of yachts or parties. I thought about preservation, privacy, peace. A week after I spoke to Tobias Marsh, my lawyer, the same one who'd handled my husband's estate, Leora appeared. She hadn't called, just dropped by with a paper bag of cinnamon rolls and a bright smile. "Thought you'd like a treat," she said. "Mind if I make a quick coffee?" "Go ahead," I said, watching her disappear into the kitchen. I'd been sorting papers that morning, trust files, old mortgage records, tax forms, all spread out across the dining table. The envelope from Vallis, Brent and Dunley was tucked underneath a folder, but only just. When she returned, something had shifted. She was too breezy, her voice just a touch too high. And when she glanced at the table, I saw it, a flicker of recognition she shouldn't have had. She smiled, waved, and left. But I knew she'd seen something. Something she was never meant to see. Leora returned the next morning with fresh scones. I hadn't asked for them. She said she'd thought of me while passing the bakery. It wasn't like her. Normally, if she dropped anything off, it was left in a grocery bag, by the door, no note, no knock. But that day, she rang the bell and stood there, smiling, like we were best friends. I invited her in. I shouldn't have, but I was curious. Her eyes scanned the living room. They lingered on my desk, then the bookshelf, then the table where the envelope had sat the night before. I'd already tucked it away. Still, the way she looked told me she had seen enough yesterday. She sat down and handed me the scone wrapped in a napkin. She asked if I needed help sorting mail or wanted her to take my car in for servicing, just in case something rattles. That part made me pause. My car had driven fine the day before. I asked why she said that. "Oh, I thought I heard it sputter when you left the store last week," she said, picking lint from her sleeve. Could just be the cold. It was August. I thanked her and told her I'd get it checked. She left with that same pleasant smile stretched across her face like a tight rubber band. That afternoon, I decided to drive into town for a cup of jasmine tea and to visit the antique shop Edgar used to mention. I never made it. Halfway down Briar Ridge, my brakes gave out. I pressed the pedal and it sank to the floor. No resistance, no sound, just air. The car veered, metal shrieked, and the world spun sideways. They told me later I was lucky. A few cracked ribs, a concussion, bruised lungs. It could have been worse. I remember one moment most clearly, right before everything went black. The scent of the scone Leora had brought lingered in the seat beside me. Sweet, perfect, and so wrong. The first time I opened my eyes, everything was fog. Light bled through the curtains in milky slivers, and a machine somewhere near my ear beeped steadily. I couldn't lift my arm. I couldn't speak. My body felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. But I was alive. They said I'd been unconscious for nearly 4 days. The nurses were kind. One of them, an older woman named Joni, gently dabbed my forehead and whispered, "Your son's been here a few times." He looked worried. Poor thing. Couldn't stay long, ICU rules, you know. But he came. I tried to picture it. Callan sitting beside me, maybe holding my hand. I hadn't felt it. I was somewhere else then. Distant. They said he asked questions. Checked in with doctors. Always looked like he wanted to do more but couldn't. The machines, the quiet beeping the glass between us, it made everything feel miles away. But Leora, she never came. Not once. I overheard Joni whisper to another aide in the hallway. The daughter-in-law. Still no sign. None, the younger nurse replied. Strange, right? After a crash like that, you'd think she'd show. I didn't say anything. I just stared at the ceiling and let the silence settle in the silence where her face, her voice should have been. But deep down, I knew why. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't busy. She didn't come because she believed, no, she was certain that I wouldn't survive. I kept quiet. I asked them not to tell anyone I'd fully regained consciousness. They looked puzzled, but they respected my wishes. I needed time. Time to think. Time to remember what Leora had said about the car. Time to understand the way she'd looked around the room, like she was searching for a letter she wasn't supposed to know existed. On the 5th morning, Joni wheeled me to a chair by the window. I sat with a blanket on my lap and watched the parking lot, waiting for someone I already knew wouldn't come. And that's when I decided I wouldn't speak too soon. Not until I knew how far Leora was willing to go. I needed to see her face when she thought I was still gone. I heard the door open, soft and hesitant. I was already awake, sitting with my head tilted just enough to appear unconscious. The nurse had adjusted my IV earlier and left the room dark, quiet. I hadn't buzzed since dawn. The footsteps were slow at first, careful. Then they stopped right beside me. She looks worse today, Leora muttered, almost to herself. I could hear the edge in her voice, tension, not concern. I stayed still. I had to. A click, then a whisper. She was on the phone. She's still out. No sign of progress. A pause. They're saying maybe another week, maybe more. But no, she hasn't spoken. Not a word. Another silence. Then her voice dropped lower. No one else knows about the inheritance. Callan thinks she just had some stocks, maybe a small savings. But the trust. She didn't tell anyone. I checked everything, her files, her safe. Nothing's registered yet. She didn't update anything legally. Which means if she passes without naming anyone else, her voice trailed off, then came back sharper. Yes, of course it'll go to Callan. He's next of kin. It's all clean, unless she wakes up. She exhaled slowly. I thought the breaks would be enough. Guess she's more stubborn than we expected. I felt my hand twitch under the blanket. I focused on keeping it still. Then footsteps again. Closer to my head this time. I could feel her breath when she leaned over. You really should just go, Marletha. Make this easier for everyone. The door clicked shut behind her. I waited a full minute before letting myself breathe. My throat was dry and my chest ached from staying still so long. But I had heard it. All of it. She didn't just know about the money. She had planned for me to die. Quietly. Conveniently. And now she was counting the days. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the money wouldn't go where she thought. Not if I had anything to do with it. A week before the crash, I'd gone to see my lawyer, a quiet man named Tobias Marsh, who'd handled my late husband's estate decades earlier. I trusted him not just because he was discreet, but because he always listened without rushing. That morning, I'd told him everything about the unexpected inheritance, about Edgar, and about my concerns. I don't want it going to someone just because of a bloodline, I said. Especially if they're waiting for me to vanish. He nodded once and took notes. By the end of the hour, we'd created a conditional clause if I passed due to suspicious circumstances. An accident, a delay in medical attention, anything deemed questionable. The entire trust would divert to a historical preservation fund Edgar once supported. The foundation would receive everything. Not Callan, not Leora. It wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring legacy meant something. Tobias filed the papers that same day, and I took a sealed copy home with me, slipping it inside an old photo album that no one had touched in years. It was still there the morning of the accident. I remembered because I'd glanced at it while grabbing my purse. The scone Leora brought was still warm. Now, lying in this hospital bed, her words still fresh in my ears, I felt a strange calm settle over me. She thought she was one step away from winning. She thought I hadn't named anyone. That the fortune would flow to Callan, and by extension, to her. But I had already written them both out of it. What Leora didn't know, what she couldn't even imagine, was that her silence, her cruelty, and her absence were building a case I didn't need to argue. I just had to let her keep talking, keep assuming, keep stepping into her own trap. All I needed was to wait for the right moment to rise. And that moment arrived the day she walked through the door, dressed in black, ready to grieve someone she didn't know was watching. She entered like she was preparing for a eulogy. Black blouse, soft curls, pinned back heels too loud for a hospital hallway. Her makeup was flawless, but her smile was rehearsed. She walked in with a clipboard in her hand and a tissue already tucked into her sleeve, ready to weep if needed, ready to lie. She didn't see me at first. I was sitting upright in the recliner beside the bed, wrapped in a shawl, sipping water through a straw. The curtains were half drawn. The nurse had helped me into the chair earlier that morning. I asked her not to announce anything. Let Leora believe the fantasy for one more minute. She turned toward the bed and paused. Something didn't register. Then she looked left and saw me. Our eyes met. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. Then her hand flew to her chest. A strangled, breathless sound escaped her throat. She screamed. It wasn't theatrical or controlled. It was raw, panicked, like a child waking from a nightmare and realizing it's still real. She stumbled backward, hitting the tray table, sending a cup of water crashing to the floor. You're, she stammered. Alive. I finished for her voice steady. Yes, very much so. She looked like she might faint. Her hands trembled. I watched her glance toward the door as if debating whether to run or continue the act. You weren't supposed to be, she started, then stopped herself. I set the cup down, leaned forward slightly. I've been awake longer than you think. The silence between us thickened. I heard everything, Leora. Every word you whispered when you thought I couldn't hear. She didn't deny it, just blinked once then again, as if trying to reboot her face into something neutral. I stood slowly. My ribs still ached, but I needed to look her in the eye. You really should have waited until I was dead, I said quietly. But you were always impatient. She opened her mouth again, but I turned away, pressing the call button with one finger. I believe it's time my son came in. Callan walked in, eyes tired, tie loose around his neck. He looked between us, confused by the way Leora had frozen in place near the window. Her face pale. You called for me? He asked gently, his gaze settling on me with hesitant concern. I nodded. Close the door, Callan. He did. I need you to hear something I said. I reached into the small canvas bag beside my chair and pulled out my phone. My fingers were slow but steady. I opened the voice recorder. I pressed play. Leora's voice filled the room, soft, calculating, unmistakable. The recording from the day she visited while I was pretending to sleep. Every word about the breaks, about the inheritance, about hoping I wouldn't wake up. Callan didn't move at first. He just stood there, eyes locked on the phone, as if it might burst into flames. When it ended, the silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd felt in weeks. Leora didn't say a word. Her hands were clenched at her sides. Is this true? Callan's voice cracked. She turned to him, suddenly animated. She's lying. She set me up. You know how she twists things. He held up a hand. Leora, don't. She flinched. I asked you to look after her while I handled things at work. I trusted you. I did what I had to, she snapped. You really think she was going to keep it in the family? With her, it always ends up in some charity for strangers. She's always been like that, too generous with outsiders, never with us. I was just trying to claim what should have been ours. Callan's face shifted, something between disbelief and grief. He looked at me softer now. You didn't tell me about the inheritance, he said. I was going to, I replied. But then I saw how quickly silence turned to schemes. He nodded once. No excuses. No outrage. Just quiet shame. I turned to him, voice calm. The documents are already filed. What happens next is out of your hands. Callan didn't argue. He simply looked at his wife. And for the first time, I saw him truly see her. The first disbursement to the foundation cleared on a Friday. I watched the transaction confirmation on Tobias's iPad, then signed the next set of paperwork. It felt quiet, clean, like setting something back in order after a long, strange storm. The fund would go toward historical preservation scholarships for underserved students and a shelter Edgar once supported anonymously. He would have liked this. It wasn't noise, it was legacy. Tobias left that afternoon with a leather folder under his arm, promising to keep me updated. I stood in the doorway for a long time after he pulled out of the driveway. The wind had picked up. Something in it felt unsettled. It was only 2 days later that Detective Rayner called. We've received a formal complaint and some corroborating evidence, he said. May we come speak with you in person? When they arrived, 2 officers, quiet but focused. I offered them tea. They declined. One of them opened a small binder, laid out a printed statement. A neighbor's doorbell camera had caught Leora walking around the driver's side of my car the morning of the accident. A few minutes later, she was seen leaving hurriedly, alone. They weren't arresting her. Not yet. But she was officially under investigation for attempted murder. I sat with it in silence. The teacup on the counter had gone cold. Everything in the room had a stillness to it, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. Callan hadn't called. Neither had she. But that no longer mattered. I pulled Edgar's letter from the cedar chest and reread it one last time. His trust in me. His faith that I would use what he left behind for something better. And now I knew exactly where every last dollar was going. The cottage was smaller than I expected, but perfect. Tucked between wild pines and the rocky coastline, its windows faced the water, and the salt air met me at the porch. Tobias had left the keys and a welcome note in the mailbox. I let the wind carry the quiet as I stepped inside. The rooms smelled of cedar and ocean. I walked through them slowly, touching old books, glass jars and blankets folded in neat stacks. Remnants of a man who'd once lived here alone and had somehow trusted me with the ending of his story. I unpacked only the essentials: a sweater, my tea tin, Edgar's letter, and the photo of Callan as a baby still smiling from inside a cracked silver frame. I didn't hang it. I wasn't sure I needed to. The foundation sent confirmation. The next day, Edgar's fortune, redirected per my wishes, was already at work funding historical scholarships, preservation grants, and a small women's archive in Rhode Island. Leora wouldn't see a cent. Callan, to his credit, wrote again. This time a letter. Long. Apologetic. I read every word and set it gently in a drawer. He'd made his choice the moment he let her speak for him. Maybe someday I'd write back. But not now. Here in this place, no one could twist my words or try to outlive my signature. I brewed my tea on a quiet stove. I listened to gulls call in the distance, and for the first time in a long while, I felt safe. They would never find this house, never step through its doors or stand on its porch pretending they belonged. Leora had tried to erase me before I had the chance to live out what Edgar left behind, but I had survived. I had outlived her greed. Now every morning I watched the tide roll in through the glass, and every evening I locked the door not out of fear, but because it was mine.